thank God for other Christians. We should, shouldn't we? We should thank God for Christians, whether they're Christians in our doorstep or Christians on the other side of the world. Love other believers. Thank God for them. There in the capital city, at the very heart of the pagan Roman Empire, there in Rome, there's a people who have turned to God. And they're making an impact. Verse 8, your faith is being reported all over the world. And Paul rejoices. And he goes on to tell these Christians in Rome how he prays for them. He prays for them, verse 9, constantly. He prays for them, verse 10, at all times. Do you do that? Do you pray for Christians in other places? Maybe places where it's kind of difficult to be a Christian. Love other believers, says Paul. And then he says, pray for them. And look what else Paul prays. Verse 10, I pray that now at last by God's will, the way may be opened for me to come to you. Paul had planned to go to Rome before. Many times, he says in verse 13. But his plans hadn't worked out, and now he writes to the church in Rome. Verse 11, I long to see you, that I may impart to you some spiritual gift. And the word Paul uses here doesn't mean a gift of the Spirit, but verse 12 tells us this is about mutual encouragement. It's a really important ministry, going out of your way to spend time with other Christians, especially Christians who are finding things difficult, and encouraging them. So thank God for them, pray for them, spend time with them. You don't have to get in a boat and cross to the other side of the known world like Paul does. You can be a real encouragement to Christians right here in Birmingham. So love other believers, thank God for them, pray for them, spend time with them. Well, yes, but the main reason Paul is heading to Rome is the unbelievers in Rome. Verse 13. In order, he says, I want to come in order that I might have a harvest among you, just as I have had among the other Gentiles. Now look what Paul says about the gospel. I am a debtor, he says in verse 14. I am a debtor. And then verse 15, that is why I am so eager to preach the gospel also to you who are in Rome. I've been given the gospel to pass on to you. So for those of us who are already Christians, do you really believe the gospel is for everyone? Well, I know you do in principle, but do you act on that? Are there people you don't speak to about Jesus? Are there people who in your heart of hearts you don't think they could really be saved? I'm not talking about what you say you believe, but what you actually do in practice. Are there people you feel are somehow off limits for salvation? You never say that, but that's how it works out. Look at what they're like. They'd never become Christians, would they? Well, later in Romans, Paul was going to write this. Everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. And he goes on, how can they call on the one they have not believed in? And how can they believe in the one of whom they have not heard? And how can they hear without someone preaching to them? And the answer is they can't. Can they? And they won't. The only person you can be sure won't believe in Jesus is the person who never hears about Jesus. And we just need to ask ourselves, is that a decision I'm comfortable to take, not telling somebody? The most unlikely people become Christians. Think of John Newton, who wrote that hymn, Amazing Grace. He was a notorious slave trader till he became a Christian. Then he became a pastor and a hymn writer. Would you have told John Newton the gospel when he was brutalizing his human cargo in the high seas? Or what about you and me? Were we likely candidates for salvation? I know I wasn't. There's a challenge here, isn't there? Most of us aren't going to be globe-trotting evangelists like Paul, but all of us who are Christians have been entrusted with the gospel. It's a little bit like, perhaps, think of a research scientist who discovers a cure for cancer, all cancer. There's a duty to tell other people, isn't there? There's an obligation. If someone had that sort of knowledge which would save millions of lives every year and kept it to himself, that would be nothing sort of criminal. It would be immoral. And that's the way the Apostle Paul feels about telling other people the gospel. Look what he says, verse 14, I am a debtor. When it comes to the gospel, says Paul, I'm in debt to other people. Now, there's more than one way of getting into debt. If you're in debt to a bank or a credit card company, it's because you borrowed money from them, and eventually you'll have to pay it back. But this is a different sort of debt. Paul hasn't borrowed anything from the Romans. Rather, he's been given something for the Romans. And that something is the gospel. So imagine you're a student at Birmingham University. Maybe you are this morning. And a friend from your hometown comes to Birmingham for the weekend, and your parents give her £300 for you. Is it her money? No, it's not her money. It's your money. And your friend is a debtor to you until she hands the money over. Now that's what Paul is saying about the gospel. The gospel isn't Paul's little secret. The gospel isn't for Paul's personal, private satisfaction. He's under an obligation to pass on the gospel. He's a debtor. He's in debt to the rest of the world. He's in debt to everyone. Verse 14, I am a debtor both to Greeks and non-Greeks, both to the wise and the foolish. And it's no different for us. We're debtors to those around us. The gospel doesn't belong to us. The gospel is God's message for the world. So tell everyone the gospel. And amen, we say. And then so often we don't do it. Why? Well, in some parts of the world, that might be because we're fearful of persecution. That's not true in the United Kingdom. Not yet, anyway. But Paul knows why. It's because we're embarrassed. Paul writes, look at it, verse 16, I am not ashamed of the gospel. And we want to say, well, how could anybody be ashamed of a message like this? And yet we are ashamed, aren't we, at times? Let me tell you about a man who was actually not just a man, he was God. And he got himself executed 2,000 years ago, and he did it on purpose for me, and then he came back to life. And even as we say it, it sounds sort of unlikely, doesn't it? And the vast majority of people aren't convinced, and we think we're pretty peculiar, and we don't want to be thought of as peculiar, and we're ashamed. And Paul says, don't be. Don't be. Why not? Why should we not be ashamed of the gospel? Well, Paul says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. Why not, Paul? I am not ashamed of the gospel, verse 16, because it is the power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes. Recognize the power of the gospel. Now, I wonder how many of you have seen that old movie, Crocodile Dundee. You seen Crocodile Dundee? It's great fun. And Crocodile Dundee, the main character Dundee, is walking home back in New York one evening, and he's accosted by some youths who try and mug him and his girlfriend. And the head of the gang pulls out this knife and shouts, "Give us your wallet." And Dundee's girlfriend says, "Just hand it over, just hand it over." And Dundee asks her, "Why?" "Because they've got a knife." And Dundee says, "That's not a knife. This is a knife." And he pulls out this enormous machete. And the muggers do a runner. You frightened about what people think about the gospel, asks Paul? Are you frightened because the gospel sounds weak? It's not weak. The gospel is the power of God for salvation. The gospel is huge. What else can change a person from the inside out?